In the 18th century, the Indian subcontinent was not controlled by the British, nor was it ruled by the Mughal emperors. The dominant geopolitical force was a massive indigenous power known as the Maratha Confederacy. But by 1819, this native superpower had vanished. Their vast territories were dismantled and swallowed whole, leaving the British East India Company in total control of the subcontinent. The East India Company, a profit-driven corporation with its own private military, engineered this total administrative takeover. The final, decisive confrontation between these two powers was the Third Anglo-Maratha War. By examining this brief, brutal conflict, we can perform an autopsy on an empire. The sudden military collapse of the Marathas was the fatal climax of a slow-moving, systemic structural failure that had been eating away at the empire from the inside. To understand how the empire broke, we have to look at how it was built. In the 17th century, the warrior king Chhatrapati Shivaji laid the foundation of the Maratha state. He relied on brilliant guerrilla warfare tactics and a unifying vision called Hindavi Swarajya, meaning the independent self-rule of the native people. Over the next 100 years, political authority gradually shifted from a single monarch to a line of prime ministers, known as the Peshwas. Under their leadership, the Marathas expanded their borders massively across central and northern India. This diagram illustrates how that rapid expansion introduced a fatal vulnerability. To manage their sprawling new territories, the state morphed into a loosely tied confederacy. Power was delegated to autonomous regional chiefs from prominent families, like the Shindes and the Holkars. Decentralizing power allowed for rapid growth, but it eroded their unity. By the early 19th century, the Marathas were no longer fighting as a cohesive state. They operated as disjointed factions, driven entirely by regional self-interests. The British East India Company operated on a completely different model. They were highly centralized and strictly disciplined, and obsessively focused on logistical control. They also held a massive intelligence advantage. British officials cultivated vast networks of local spies. Before the war even began, the company had meticulously tracked the Peshwas' movements and mapped out the terrain. On the battlefield, the gap widened. The Marathas continued to rely heavily on traditional cavalry charges. Their troops were highly mobile, but they were largely armed with spears and swords against an industrializing enemy. They recognized the need for modern artillery and imported foreign cannons. However, they failed to develop the native engineering expertise to maintain or operate them, relying heavily on Arab mercenaries to fire their own guns. Conversely, the East India Company standardized its weaponry across all its regiments. They rigorously drilled their infantry forces, ensuring that every sepoy could fire continuous volleys with mechanical precision. The British systematically out-organized and out-spied the Maratha Confederacy. By the time open conflict broke out, the war was already deeply asymmetrical. The breaking point arrived in 1817. Recognizing the tightening grip of the British, Peshwa Bajirao II launched a desperate uprising to reclaim Maratha sovereignty. This map shows how the East India Company anticipated the move. Using preemptive diplomacy, they severed the communication lines between the regional chiefs. The most powerful military commander, Dalit Rao Shinde, surrendered before firing a shot. With the Confederacy fractured, the British dismantled the remaining factions one by one. Holkar forces were crushed at Mahidpur, and the Bhonsle army overwhelmed at Sitaboldi. Without a unified command, these regional resistance efforts were systematically erased. The Confederacy's deeply fractured structure meant that their final stand was ultimately reduced to a series of isolated, uncoordinated defeats. By 1819, the physical Maratha Empire was officially dissolved. The last Peshwa surrendered to the British and was banished to a small estate on a pension. With the Marathas eliminated, a massive transfer of territory and wealth occurred. Priceless assets like the Nasak diamond were seized as spoils of war, cementing the East India Company's total economic and political dominance over the region. The company used this definitive victory to redraw the map of India. They established a geopolitical paramountcy that would hold the subcontinent firmly under British control until 1947. Yet, while the physical state was erased, the founding concept of Hindavi Swarajya, independent self-rule, survived the battlefield. Nearly a century later, Early 20th century independence leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak resurrected the term Swaraj. They weaponized the memory of Maratha sovereignty to rally the Indian public against the very empire that had defeated them. The Marathas lost the 19th century war for their empire, but the ideological seed they planted became the rallying cry that would eventually win back the nation.